Stop, would you kindly? Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase.
Would you kindly? Would you kindly get this?
We know what happens in this moment, and we know how it's meaningful. The cutscene takes control away from the player, but what happens after? What happens just before? And most importantly, what happens when those moments play in a sequence? In his essay, BioShock is Plato's Cave, Roger Travis argues the point of BioShock isn't the moment when you kill Andrew Ryan in a cutscene, it's what happens after that. Atlas/Fontaine asks you to abort the self-destruct sequence, as Travis describes it, but the self-destruct sequence won't end either in success or in failure, and the game won't proceed unless you insert the relevant item into the requisite slot. It is a moment of resignation, of embodied realization that the player still and always will be, in Ryan's words, a slave that obeys. For Travis, this moment of reluctant activity is different and precious because of the way BioShock contextualizes it, with the words of Ryan ringing in your ear. But it's not only the words, it's also the cutscene. It's the transition that matters from cutscene to gameplay, not one separate from the other. If play is a bit more scripted than we like to think, then perhaps cutscenes are a bit more interactive than we presume. The existing literature on cutscenes says otherwise. At worst, cutscenes are remnants of a dying medium, cinema, ruining the ludic purity of games. At best, cutscenes exist to provide narrative or generic context to gameplay. Rune Clevier, in an essay entitled In Defense of Cutscenes, argues that a cutscene does not cut off gameplay. It is an integral part of the configurative experience. Even if the player is denied any active input, this does not mean that the ergodic experience and effort is paused. A cutscene is never truly cinematic, no matter how poorly implemented it may be. In any case, it cannot avoid affecting the rhythm of the gameplay. This need not be in the negative sense. Yet even Clevier reduces cutscenes to their narrative importance. For him, it is rhetoric, a genre context for gameplay. A rigid dichotomy exists between narrative and interactivity, passivity and activity. What if, instead, we paid close attention to the rhythm of gameplay? The BioShock franchise is ideal for exploring the rhythmic possibilities of cutscenes. As Matthew Wysocki and Betsy Bray remind us, the BioShock series continually reminds players that they do not have control over the situations at hand. As a franchise, BioShock is useful then because it engages with questions of agency, because it is variably designed by one of the only mainstream game auteurs, and because the ludic and narrative similarities between games offer a base for comparison. My argument is that the idea of the cutscene as a passive and cinematic element needs to be abandoned. The cutscene is never experienced only as a cutscene, but as another representational moment integrated into the embodied temporal plane of the game. There is overlap and transition between moments of open and closed input. In this framework, not playing becomes part of the phenomenological experience of playing games. I'll take up 3 moments from each game, an introduction, a fall, and a conclusion that share ludonarrative qualities. By paying attention to the alternation between open and closed input instead of the false dichotomy between activity and passivity, I will tease out the indiscernibility of the cutscene as it exists in play. What I'm saying specifically is that maybe we shouldn't think of a cutscene as starting here and ending here, and we definitely shouldn't think of play as somehow stopping in between. Because the BioShock franchise doesn't exist in a vacuum, and my experience of play informs my research, a quick note on approach. As Paul Chain writes in his essay, Waiting for Something to Happen, the demarcation between gameplay and cutscene as activity versus passivity is an overly simplistic one. My interest in blurring these terms develops from playing what's derisively known as walking simulators. Games like Dear Esther and Gone Home challenge the idea of being active in gameplay. All they demand is moving, looking, and the occasional object interaction. What makes this activity any more meaningful than holding my body to attention when watching a movie? Let's turn to the games in the cutscenes. What activity does a player carry into each cutscene? What choices do they carry out? In other words, what are the ludonarrative tensions, the open and closed inputs of game and narrative at play in these rhythms? Here's your first sight of Rapture. And here's Columbia. In both cases, the player transitions from full control to partial control to full control, from mystery to awe to activity in that world. Richard, in his presentation last week, offered the term navigable cutscene to make sense of this partial control, this still open input, which can be used to produce fear. In both games, the player brings the ambiguous danger of the lighthouse into the cutscene, then brings the awe of seeing the world into their movement in that world. In the case of Infinite, this limited agency calms us after the horror of the lighthouse. BioShock 2 does something completely different. Rapture is introduced through gameplay, giving the player the option to skip its introduction altogether. Rhythmically, the game invites you to close input manually and stop moving to take in the view, as YouTuber Zevik does here. This raises all sorts of questions about interpolation, labor, and storytelling, as the player is asked to be their own cinematographer, editor, and narrative. But in this moment, there is little need to move forward, unlike the game's usual use of cutscenes. BioShock 2 introduces the interrupting cutscene to the franchise. The Fall here integrates a moment of closed input into gameplay, and this closed input is experienced ludically since there are no visual cues. It's almost short enough to go unnoticed. Infinite does the same thing, except it exaggerates these interruptions. Closed input becomes a spectacular loss of control and extension of danger. However, the games are structured around different rhythmic patterns. BioShock 2 uses the cutscene to transition away from danger. Input is closed to end gameplay to safely move the avatar somewhere new. Even if Infinite adopts the interrupting cutscene, its rhythmic pattern is closer to BioShock's. The Fall here takes place in the traditional cutscene, yet this moment of closed input doesn't move the player away from danger. It heightens it. The open input of movement after the cutscene is loaded with tension. The player knows enemies are lurking. They know they might not be in full control of their body. Like its use of the interrupting cutscene, the traditional cutscene in BioShock 2 releases tension at the climax of the game. The player has just fought two big sisters and brings this sense of ludic and narrative danger into a cutscene that acts as transition. Little is sustained through the closed input the cutscene demands. Like the opening of the game, Delta simply reawakens, and the player is promised safe control. Consider this in contrast with the climax of BioShock, where the cutscene doesn't act as transition, doesn't release tension, but maintains and twists it. BioShock and Infinite share a rhythmic pattern, using moments of closed input to heighten open input, or play through alternation in a given sequence. Both games play with the sensation of not playing by integrating the two together. Infinite, then, is something of a combination of its predecessors, using BioShock 2's interrupting cutscenes to heighten rather than release tension. But it also introduces something new to the franchise, the idea of open input during the cutscene. What really constitutes play or passivity? Infinite makes the cutscene indiscernible, letting it infect play and play infect closed input in a complex rhythm. The final sequence is what exactly? Paul Booth, in the reading for this week, calls it a long cutscene, and yet the game is continually demanding the player's input. In fact, it highlights this acquiescence, this small amount of open input, with a gentle thud. A design choice that, unlike the mechanical click of BioShock or the quietness of BioShock 2, lends the smallest player gesture weight. Of course, there are many more moments of closed input in this franchise. The ending animations, the moments of directed attention, the elevator rides with Elizabeth. I chose these scenes because they offer resonances to draw out the rhythmic patterns of each game. BioShock's use of closed input to accentuate and heighten moments of open input. BioShock 2's use of cutscenes to transition the player away from danger, and Infinite's interruption of play and cutscenes to constantly negotiate the two. Further research could consider this franchise in context with other contemporary games playing with ideas about open and closed input. These moments in the BioShock franchise challenge the idea of play as activity and the idea that games must be a single ludic thing. There's a strange and beautiful ambient potential in the ambiguity of Infinite's final extended cutscene. Like the moment after killing Andrew Ryan, there's a choice to let things stay this way forever in a space that's not quite a game and not quite a cutscene. A sense of prolonged climax waiting for the simple press of a button to end the story.